Doesn't it pop up on Facebook? Is that how we figured it out last time?
Yeah, and it takes a minute for people to roll in. So it's starting up now. It's fetching the links. And we're live.
Welcome, everyone. We are hopefully live for our second webinar on teaching social work with digital technology, book groups. And I'm Nancy Smith. I'm the Dean at the University of Buffalo School of Social Work. And I'm here with my co-authors. Actually, I'm the co-author. They were the lead authors. And our facilitator for this month, Beth Castleman Carpenter, who's going to kick us off. She's at Southern Connecticut State University. Beth?
So hi, everyone. I'm actually here representing our whole team. So I'm representing Jonathan Singer and Natalie Jones, both of whom couldn't be here for the live session, but you have seen posting for the first 3 weeks of our unit. So hello, everyone. The three of us are really excited because we think we got one of the most fun chapters, perhaps from the instructor perspective, not the student perspective, in talking about tech-based and tech-mediated assignments.
And Beth, my bad. I didn't have Melanie and Laurel introduce themselves. So let me, if you don't mind, jumping in. And Melanie, why don't you go first, since you're to my left on my screen.
I'm Melanie Sage at the University of Buffalo School of Social Work.
I'm Laurel Hitchcock. I'm at the Department of Social Work at the University of Alabama at Birmingham.
And here we are back to Beth to lead us into some cool questions.
So we've had some great comments about how folks are using tech-based tools in class and also in assignments, and had some great questions. So it seems like our hot topic, and I warned the team because I couldn't even answer it all that well, is really about folks' experience around using e-portfolios. Seems like there's a lot of curiosity about the best way to use them. Perhaps there are specific tools around them. So I'd like to ask the three of you kind of your perspectives on e-portfolios and what your experiences have been.
Yeah. So I'm going to kick this question off, and I had to go to the book to read some about it because I realized that this is one of the tools that we talk about in learning management systems. And a lot of the learning management systems that we have these add-on e-portfolio tools. I use Canvas here at my university, and I have used the e-portfolio tool within a course to help students sort of summarize their learning from the semester. So they had to build a small portfolio, pulling in assignments and then doing a final reflection. And these are service learning courses I teach. I did not find the tools really effective. Students were able to do it, but it didn't look really good. They were very easy for me to assess and grade because they were within the learning management system. So while I said all that, I really want to take a bigger step back as I think about this question. And I think it really depends on the purpose of the portfolio and how or why you're using it. So if you're using it in a course and you want to help students pull together and reflect on what they're doing in a course, some of these e-portfolio tools within a learning management system probably could work very well. If you were thinking about this for a larger sort of across the program, and thinking about it in terms of assessment and program assessment, then I think we want to look for different tools to do that. I will say for my courses now, so I recognize I'm jumping around a little bit here in this question, but hopefully I can get to it. In my courses, instead of using the Canvas portfolio tool now, I use LinkedIn instead. And I ask students to create a LinkedIn account and then do some reflection in their within LinkedIn as they are also describing what they did. So my students do a lot of service learning across 3 semesters that I teach them. And so for each of these courses, I ask them to go in and put that volunteer experience in there and then reflect. And they can also build that across other courses. And then they have a nice sort of front-facing portfolio that they can share when they go into field education. So I like that because they can carry that with them wherever they go. Within Canvas, as soon as they don't have access to Canvas, it goes away. Now, of course, there are lots of other portfolio tools that are available to institutions and to departments that can be add-ons to learning management systems, or they can just be separate. And those tend to cost a lot of money. If your organization is using one of the assessment software tools, or that helps to organize fields, something like Watermark or TaskStream by Watermark, TK20. A lot of those platforms also have e-portfolio tools that students can use. Depending on the account and the programming and the software, they have access to those after they leave. But again, I tend to find those tools very clunky and not very helpful, which is why I like to use LinkedIn. Let's see, I was looking through my notes I will say that at our institution, we are looking at a platform called Portfolium, which is going to interact well with Canvas. And one of the benefits of this particular tool is that they have an integrated badging system within there, so that students can, we can create what's called a pathway. And then as students complete those different points and they're assessed, they can earn a badge, which would be front-facing. And those students would have access that to for their entire lives, as long as they were using it. So Melanie and Nancy, I don't know if you have anything else to add. And gosh, I tried to answer that. I hope I answered that question.
I think this is a really great place for our book group members to chime in, because they're going to have more direct experience. When I was the BSW director at my previous institution, we looked at some of these portfolio systems, and you're right, like Chalk and Wire is a popular one, others, that they offer an infrastructure in the way that we considered using it, and that I've seen other programs use it, is that students upload a model assignment from each of their classes that kind of connect to the competencies across the curriculum. And then it becomes a tool to assess the competencies for CSWE purposes. And it's kind of a more qualitative assessment, which might work better for smaller programs than very large ones, because then you need somebody to be able to go through and kind of rate the completeness of that portfolio, or sometimes the grade is transferred directly in from the class for that assignment as an example of that portfolio. But again, I agree that those they feel a little clunky, and it's a lot of work to put in for maybe that not quite front-facing ongoing use evaluation. What we ended up doing instead, because we did want to get to kind of that qualitative assessment that students had met each of the learning outcomes, we had a separate, we called it a comp exam halfway through our MSW program, where students uploaded a short paragraph for each of the competencies in the program about where they had met that competency across their curriculum, which kind of served a similar purpose without the cost of a formal e-portfolio.
And, I'll jump in on this too, but you're going to, I guess, hear kind of a theme among the three of us. First off, I think one of the biases that I have, and I think Melanie and Laurel sort of share it, is we're not a huge believer in using tools that students won't continue to get access to after they leave a program. It's not to say that we never do that, and we certainly use learning management systems, partly in some cases because we don't have a choice, but also, it's just that if I have a choice between a tool students will use in their professional career versus a tool that goes away after the university, I always go with the professional career option. I think it enhances students transferring skills. And quite honestly, mostly the commercial market does a better job of these things than they do for the educational market. So I've liked using LinkedIn. LinkedIn has the option to highlight projects, but I think it really comes back to what's the purpose of the e-portfolio? is it something you're using for assessment purposes, which is fine, but let's be real about this. Students probably aren't going to find that all that useful. We use TaskStream. I don't believe we use the portfolio mode. Melanie and I just taught a course in our online DSW program where they had actually one of the assignments at the end was to discuss the course objectives and provide, assessment and evidence of how they met each of those. And that was really a portfolio type assignment, although we didn't call it that. But it certainly, I think, helps them realize how much they learned and consolidate learning. So I think there's great purposes there, but ultimately it's why do you want to use it? If it's for assessment, then you got to do it, right? There's something you got to do for assessment. But if it's for the student to use as they go out on the market, then you want things that are better forward facing. And certainly it sounds like, Laurel, you have access to some of those tools. We use a badging system here at UB, which we're starting to roll out right now for micro-credentials, but we'll have the ability for other types of uses. And that actually interfaces with LinkedIn, so students can put them on their LinkedIn profiles, and then employers can click through and see what skills go into it. So that's great. But I also think that students could use things like Google Sites, and create their own portfolio. They could use a WordPress blog. They could use SlideShare as a way to highlight, things they've created. And I am much more of someone who pushes people to those places, because I also think you make all sorts of professional connections there. And when something's just associated with your university, I don't think it tends to get the kind of overall adoption and use. Now, I would love to hear that I'm wrong about this, and that's where I go back to what Melanie said, is please, if you have some amazing examples of e-portfolios, I'd love to hear them. The last thing to say about this is we actually have an e-portfolio system at UB. Melanie, you might be surprised to hear that, because I believe we've adopted them mostly for undergraduate education. We don't have an undergraduate degree. We have just rolled out a minor in community development and community organizing. So we don't have enough students in that yet to do a portfolio. But they were encouraging faculty to consider using it at one point to highlight their work. And we had them come and present, and it was kind of cool until I asked the question of, would someone be able to export their data from it to another platform? And they had no ability to do that in the e-portfolio. In which case I said to faculty, I would not bother. There's a really good chance that we'll be switching portfolio systems, because that's what universities do periodically. And can you imagine how you're going to feel after having put all the work into something and then have no way of extracting it? And I said, if you want an e-portfolio, use Google Sites. At least then you can get your data in and out. So that's really a really vital question I would ask of e-portfolio systems, is if you're using one that's internal to the university, or external for that matter, do you have the ability to export it and so that you could move it into another system? I mean, it's not going to be seamless, but you'll at least be able to get a head start in that. And that's partly why using these platforms that are more widely available, I think, can be advantageous to students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Nancy, I'll just add, I was even thinking that there are students or assignments where you could do this in a blog form as well. So it doesn't have to be through one of these systems at all. LinkedIn is a great one, but blogs, or even, doing something like creating an infographic of their learning over the course, or using, we can use infographics to create CVs. And so there are a lot of ways to do that. And I think you also raise a really good point about faculty, because I know at our university, they now have a new system that is supposed to, it's the front-facing page for all of the faculty, and we have to go in and input all this data. And I struggle just to keep my CV up. And so how we, the systems that we put all this information in, it's incredibly time-consuming. And so I really appreciate the question, or the thoughtfulness to ask about, how long is this system going to be around, or can we export it? I think these are really important questions to be asking.
Great, thank you all. I know at our institution we use TK20, but it's purely for institutional assessment. Students find it bulky, particularly if they forget their password.
That's a great point. But you have to remember the password.
So I love the idea of Google Sites, SlideShare, LinkedIn. I think that's wonderful. So thank you all for those resources. Our next question is around digital resources with publishers and textbooks. So we're changing direction a little bit. because it sounds like folks in the book group have had really mixed experiences. And I know a colleague and I are working on actually developing some digital resources for textbooks. So I have a personal interest in this question too, because we know how we don't want to do it. But I think our book club members would love to hear what your experiences have been with those digital resources, pros and cons.
Okay. You want me to start this one, ladies?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So, I say this all the time to students when they ask me questions, so I'm going to say it here too. Well, it depends. It depends on the resource, it depends on the publisher, and it depends on what you're doing, right? Overall, I find that digital content created by publishers is maybe at best a good starting point for what I want to do. Anytime I'm doing a new course prep, I will always go to the publisher's website with the textbook and download any of the PowerPoint slides, any of the handouts that they have. Sometimes they'll have information like articles that are connected with it. And then I use that to help build my course. Sometimes I use the information, sometimes I don't. It just really depends on the content. PowerPoint slides, if it's just a regurgitation of the textbook, students aren't going to want to see that, and I'm not going to want to lecture or talk about it from that. So if there's content that I can link to, like a video, and then of course you got to go and look at that video, because some of those videos are incredibly outdated, right? I mean, it's hard to develop this content and it's hard to keep it updated. I can say that I tried once to use a tool developed by a publisher that was supposed to integrate with our learning management system, and would be quizzes and readings. And the big thing that I wanted to, the reason I wanted to use it was because the students then had access to a digital copy of the textbook. Very quickly, I realized that the integration did not work well at all, and my learning curve on how to integrate that was too high, and I just didn't feel like I could ask the students to do it. So I just simply said, you now have access to a digital copy of the textbook, and here's how you can use it. And ever since then, I have not done that, because it's just one more thing to learn about and one more thing to try to integrate. And even though publishers are oftentimes very helpful and they want to take you through a training to do it, I still have to be able to train my students on how to use it and answer all of their questions, right? And we all know, because we use these digital tools, there's so many variables to it. It might depend on the student's laptop or what browser they're using. Sometimes it depends on, is it a Mac or is it a PC? Is it a device, or is it, there are just so many variables. So that's sort of been my experience with digital resources.
I'll add to this, but I have not taught undergraduate courses, so I'd be clear about that. In my graduate courses, I don't use textbooks. I use professional books. There's a difference, and they don't come with those resources. So I have zero experience with these tools, except to occasionally have seen some things people have shared that they were trying to use, which I would just second what Laurel said. The quality has been very variable. The most experience I have at this point is that, our school produces a podcast called In Social Work, which comes out every 2 weeks with interviews with social work researchers and practitioners. We have 200 plus episodes now. And so periodically I get contacted by one of the online program managers who are putting together things for online programs. And they ask us to, for our permission to include those podcasts. So, we grant them, we don't ask them for money. But, you could come and look at the list of podcasts yourself and decide which ones you think are appropriate. So the people doing the vetting and pulling in of those things, I think they're the best of intentions, but they don't really understand always what you're trying to bring out in a course. So it would take a really high quality editorial team to put together something that I think would pass the muster for most of the faculty that I see. And honestly, I don't think publishers have those kinds of resources. The publishing industry is in trouble right now. And I find that in things that I've written, I'm lucky if we can get good editing, just editing, let alone content development around the other things. So I'm sure there are some great things out there, but in general, I haven't been overly impressed.
I'm with you. I've mostly stopped using textbooks in the master's program classes. I use mostly journal articles or maybe a supplementary text instead. And it's because I find that I can curate a set of resources that better match the learning objectives that I have for the course than any textbook can give me. But we did have this discussion when we were developing our book, right? Like, isn't it funny that we're developing this book about teaching with technology that isn't mostly digital and like constantly updatable and with direct links? Like in some cases we link out to YouTube videos or other resources from the book, and we had to figure out how to deal with these like big hairy links, and like what if that resource isn't there anymore? So but that kind of also names all the challenges that come with those digital resources, right? They change, go away, they're outdated, they're hard to keep updated, and so like I guess I feel the pain of the publishers, but I will join the not a lot of value club. But I will say there are so many content creation tools that take some initial time, but can have long-lasting value for your own purposes, like creating your own YouTube videos, or I have used TED Ed occasionally, and you can upload any YouTube video to TED Ed and then stop it at any point to ask a multiple choice or reflective question. And so you can insert those questions either at the end of the video or in intermediate sections of the video, or you can stream a couple videos together, and that's kind of a cool like do your own content creation resource. Can we ask you what kind of digital resources you were thinking about, Beth, for your new book? Do you want to tell us what your new book is?
Sure. So with my colleague Jamal Aguilar, we are creating a Hubsy textbook called Decolonizing Hubsy. So looking at lifespan development through, queer, indigenous, non-colonial lenses, we hope. And so we have it broken up into sort of three separate, and we're in our first draft. So we're in the early stages of deciding what's going to go where. And then of course, how do we make it as accessible as possible, as interactive as possible, elevating multiple voices and challenging positionality, and doing all of that in a way that the publisher can support digitally. So I'm not sure. We're just sitting in the mess a little bit right now about it. Because we want it to be useful to instructors, right, who are teaching, all students have to take a Hubsy class. So you're teaching really diverse students in this required course. So in addition to quizzes and discussions, how can we, really make it an authentic learning experience without taxing the resources of the authors and the publisher in the process?
I'm going to watch how your project comes together, because that sounds really exciting.
Yeah. And that might be a book that I would actually consider using. And I will say that maybe I shouldn't, but I'll say that we started a YouTube account for our book so that if we wanted to upload digital materials that would go with the book, there would be kind of a static YouTube link that we could push out to people and remove and add kind of as needed. So that might be a way to think about digital content instead of having them publisher attached and asking somebody else to constantly keep an eye for whether they're outdated, to think about whether there's a way for you to manage that content and kind of instead of giving the material away to the publisher, kind of pin it to your own CV about content that you're creating as complementary to a book that you've produced.
I love that idea. Thank you.
I was just going to say something like that, Melanie. how important it would be to think about creating some of this content separately. And also as you're going through this, because this sounds so exciting, Beth, I'm super excited. I even made a comment on the Facebook page that's how excited I am. That you think about the process of how you're developing this along with the content, because I could see this being very useful information for the rest of us as we think about developing textbooks and how would we do this in a very thoughtful, meaningful way. And I think this is particularly important for social work because we are about access and social justice. And so how can we make this content really available to a large group of people? So yeah, awesome.
So hopefully the anti-textbook textbook, if that's what we're going for.
So we got a question from Laura Nissen, who asked out how we manage ownership of our material, balanced with copyright. And so Nancy should talk about this because she kind of gave us a good framework for thinking about ownership of some of our like tables and things that we might want to reuse later.
Yeah, this was something I don't know. I came across probably from a lot of the online Creative Commons discussions community. And, you know, I know when I was a faculty member, not worrying about dean's roles, and people in the library would tell me not to sign the copyright agreements the way they are coming at me for articles. I never felt empowered to do that because I was so worried I wouldn't get my work published. So, you know, trying to negotiate directly with the publisher is probably not an option most of us are going to feel as comfortable with. But we developed a strategy that if it had some value, we first published it as a blog post under a Creative Commons license. And then I think I first did this with a chapter that I had in Francine Shapiro's book that a bunch of us had. That, you know, the press asked us, Guilford Press, to publish it there, and we gave them permission to use our Creative Commons license, but we wouldn't sign over to Guilford because it was already published under a copyright. And so I think you do have the option to do that, to go sort of public with a blog. Now, obviously, things get revised, and, you know, yes, you're taking risks that somebody else will steal your work, but you're always taking those risks. But for us, it means there were good portions of the content of this book that CSWE, our publisher, does not actually own, that we gave them permission to print, and that means that we can continue to use it ourselves or give other people permission. And we used it a lot in workshops and things, and that really seems like a really good workaround. So if you don't know the Creative Commons website, you just go there, they'll walk you through a few questions about how you want your work shared and attributed. And, you know, you can say people can use it as long as they attribute it to you, as long as they're not profiting off it. And if they are, that, you know, they need to get your permission, which is what our podcast does. And then we get, you know, we often don't mind giving people permission. We just want to know how it's being used. Or you can give people wide open permission to modify everything you've done and not tell you, which is, if that's what you want to do, then that's great. But then you can at least, with future publications, control who you turn that over to. And anybody I've talked to about that who really knows that world, librarians and folks said, boy, that's definitely a workaround that sounds like it really works, that you can do it. So I would encourage people who want to keep things more open access and accessible. You can still get a book, because the reality is people are willing to pay for a book to have it all in one place and beautifully organized and beautifully printed. And so I don't think that the book market's going to go away, but it does help keep things more available and accessible, so you're not in a position of not being able to use your own work, which is what starts to happen with publishers.
Thanks for that, Nancy. Are we ready for the next question, or are there other comments, Melanie? We're good? Okay. So this is another question about access, but more directly in the classroom. So a lot of folks have been talking about how they jazz up their asynchronous courses and asynchronous discussion forums by using Flipgrid, video introductions. But for many of us who work in public institutions with limited support, it's hard to get those videos captioned quickly or easy turnaround. So how do we balance, you know, tech-based assignments designed to build community while also sort of staying compliant around access or being thoughtful about it?
Melanie, is this one that you can answer?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this. This came up when we started using Flipgrid because they weren't doing captioning right at first, but they've been purchased by Microsoft and keep upping their game around disability and access. And now they have multiple options. They have that first they just had captioning after the recording, and now they have live captioning tool. They have a assisted reader tool that will show the text and highlight the words as they go by, and it's great for disability services. Also around using it with younger kids because a lot of K-12 people are using this tool now. So I think a lot of these ed tech companies are really upping their game. I understand but haven't used yet Zoom's captioning option, but my understanding is Zoom has live captioning for their chats now. And sometimes when we record a video where we don't have a captioning option, we upload it to YouTube and turn on their captioning and then copy it from YouTube to the classroom resource so that it has that captioning. And they also allow you to edit their automatic captioning, which is important because the access laws say that there has to be that it has to be pretty accurate for people who need access to the information.
I would also make a case that when students are creating videos, having them be able to learn to use the YouTube option with the captioning and edit it is actually a skill they're going to need for practice, because being able to create videos for use in agencies or with client populations or in public education campaigns, really important. And yet we need to be, all of us, learning how to make things accessible. So this is a digital literacy skill which you could build into an assignment. And yeah, it's a struggle initially. It takes a little bit of learning, but that's really also a digital literacy skill, right? Because these new technologies keep evolving. So learning how to mess around with it together, make mistakes, help each other out is part of what I think are part of the competencies for being a social worker in the 21st century. And it is good that companies are starting to up their game on this. And I think the communities are starting to hold, content producers accountable.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is an area where sometimes we're so afraid of making mistakes that it almost is paralyzing. And I like to think a lot about parallel process with students, that they get into that a lot too. Like they don't want to talk about issues of racism because they're so scared that they may make a mistake, so they don't do it at all, right? We do the same thing in thinking about some of these technology integrations. And sometimes we think too concretely about what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do. So for instance, we love infographic assignments, but a student who is blind is probably not going to have good access to being able to use that kind of assignment in the classroom. So we just need to provide an alternative assignment with equal learning objectives and outcomes, and that might take a little thought, but it's doable, right? And it's the same thing like if we have a client out in the field who is not a reader and all our bills of rights pamphlets are in English, we have to find an alternative for them that works for their particular disability or access needs. So I guess I would suggest that we need to be a little bit better at thinking outside of the box when we run into barriers and ahead of time to prepare for possible barriers. But sometimes we just really don't know what somebody's access issues are until it gets to us.
Mm-hmm. I would add along with that I have found a lot of these tools very helpful personally. I'm a big podcast fan. I like to listen to podcasts, but sometimes I download the transcripts and I read them. So in sort of adding on to what you're talking about, Melanie, that these are tools that really almost anybody can use. And so if we have the mindset that we create them across the board, we all have access to them. I know when I used videos in my asynchronous classes, those assignments, it was early on and there wasn't a lot of this or automatic captioning available. And so students had to go through and listen and type up a transcript for themselves and for the assignment. And I think this is another easy tool that we could just add to it. So if they are at the beginning of the semester and it's the first video, and it will make them pause and stop and think as they record that video what they want to say. And then if they go back and listen to it and have to put that transcript in there, they're learning a couple of, they're learning those digital literacy skills, but they're also learning the value and importance of making sure that content is accessible.
Thank you all. So kind of following up on that a little bit from the student perspective, for folks who are read the chapter, they've read the appendix, they're getting excited about bringing technology into their assignments in some way, they've reviewed the SAMR model. What's your best advice for managing student anxiety around the early adoption of these tech-mediated assignments?
Oh, Melanie, I think you need to answer this because you have just the most generous, graceful way of answering this.
Okay, I feel pressure. Well, I talk a lot about scaffolding, I think, and that we really need to ease into it, and that we need to model a learner mindset, right? That we need, like, I try to go into new assignments with some playfulness about it, and especially when I'm teaching it the first time. I say, I've never done this before. You all have probably never done this before. We're going to figure it out together, and along the way, you're going to teach me what we need to cover more because you haven't ever done this, and I don't know what's going to be hard until we get there together. Or, that we offer a lot of grace around it in that way, and that we do a lot of the parallel process stuff. And we, like I say, you may never ever create an infographic in your actual practice setting, but you're going to be thrown in front of the computer with a brand new kind of technology, and that's going to feel intimidating. So we're going to work through that, like what it feels like to be a little intimidated by new technology by applying it to this infographic assignment. And that way you will be less intimidated by being sat in front of a new technology because you'll have the experience of going, I sat through a new thing and I've done this before and it's doable. And I also just try to do a lot of scaffolding. And this was an early mistake that I made in rolling out the infographic assignment. I just said, okay, we're going to do infographics, videos that show you how, have at it. And there was a lot more anxiety around it. Later I developed kind of a scaffolding plan where I said, like, okay, during one of the first weeks of class, we're going to look at some infographics together and tell me what you like and don't like about these infographics, what makes them good and valuable, and had them critique other people's. And then we made a rubric out of that together and said, like, okay, these are clearly the things that are good about infographics, and now rate them according to the infographic. And this is the same infographic we're going to use to rate yours. Now rate a peer's. Now I'll rate it. And then send it out to the author of the paper who you based your infographic around and ask them what they think. And through this like scaffolded model, it's been reviewed a few times. I know what's good and bad about a thing. And I have this kind of authentic audience I'm going to share it with. It really kind of raises the value of the assignment and makes one a little more invested, but only because they've had enough time to think about what it's going to look like along the way.
Mm-hmm. I will add along to that by scaffolding is a great thing. I also add to that I'm going to give students the grace, and I also say the goal is to be challenged a little bit here, and we don't have to be perfect. When I started doing video assignments and Twitter assignments and all that early on, I said that this is a way to engage, and it's also a way to engage outside of the classroom. I also found it incredibly helpful to access different resources across my campus to help me with some of these tools. So I went to the library to see, is there someone who could help me with a training or something like that? I went to our digital media center, and I really looked at what was already out there that could help the students with sort of tutorials and things like that. And I found that to be a very helpful addition.
And the only Yeah, I'll just add sort of the final piece to this. You know, I'm sure this is not unique to our program. We get students, and many of them are first generation students, but not all, who are coming in and, you know, they did well in undergraduate, so they got into a graduate program, and they have expectations of themselves that are incredibly high, and not a lot of tolerance for falling short of perfection, because it's really frightening. So I think some of it is just talking about that and about, you know, my own experiences, and just that I've struggled with that, and yet at the same time, you never learn something new without taking risks. And so whenever you're learning something new, it's scary, and you're stepping into the phrase that we've tried to use here at Buffalo, because we're trauma informed. So students like the idea of creating safe spaces, but I would say that when you're taking a risk, it never feels 100% safe. And so we talk about brave spaces. Can we together take the risk to try something new and create a learning community that way? If you do structure it and scaffold it the way Melanie's suggesting, the risks are not quite so high that your entire grade is, on the table for this whole assignment. I just had this little piece I can work on. It doesn't change the fact that the high anxiety folks will still really struggle with it, is what I found. But I do think that if people talk about it and then you keep laying out how these things add together, that people get used to it. And the problem is, I mean, these technologies just keep changing so rapidly. So even the one that I feel like I know now, 6 months from now, they're going to change something and I'm not going to know what I'm doing anymore. So really talking about that we're all in this situation. And it's not that you have to know every tool and every possible technology, but we're all going to be messing up and making mistakes together. And it's great to really set up a network of people that you can ask for help, and just to say, I'm clueless. What's worked for other people with this, or, how can we do this together? Doing that within the class itself, but then modeling that in other spaces. That's where Twitter can be really helpful. I think we can go out there and say, all right, I'm clueless about how to get from here to there. Does anybody have any good suggestions? And that people get to see that. And, Melanie just had a great tweet on Twitter about getting some help from one of our doctoral students in critiquing using gender inclusive language in research. And that was a wonderful tweet that was both modeling, asking for help and taking input, but also that faculty, we don't have it all together. We need to learn from students and from consumers and, from all directions. And I think that that's part of what we want to model and talk about in our learning communities. And a really good online course is a learning community. It's not a repository for stuff people read. It's about a group of people who are connected in digital spaces to learn together.
I love that. I had been reflecting on one of the comments, I think from Ginger over at University of Houston in this module, and she talked about creating digital assignments and having an option for students who were worried about technology to do a non-digital assignment, to do a written assignment. And that's what I like the idea of differentiated curriculum, right? That somebody who has a strength in one area can use that strength if the learning objectives are equal. And then I would just add to that one of our learning objectives more and more is to teach this digital competency, right? So if we always give people an out around it, they're not going to have the experience of trying out and playing with it and going like, oh, hey, I can do this. So I would add that to a list of yes and like, yes, this is one way. And also just like we wouldn't give students the out of never having to write anything all the way through a program. We shouldn't give students the outs of never having to use technology all the way through a program, right?
Great, thank you. So our last question is, we've talked a lot about the infographic assignment, and actually Natalie, one of the co-facilitators for this month, is going to be talking about it in next week's post, so stay tuned. But from the three of you, what are some of your favorite tech-mediated assignments?
I'll start. I have two, but I really love podcasting and having students create podcasts. I started doing this, years and years ago when I was at a small teaching university. And the technology is just really manageable and easy. But if a student wants to kick it up a notch and level up by adding music or doing really sophisticated editing, they can do that. I found it's very easy to sort of talk about the podcast the same way you would a paper. You have to have an intro, you have to have your main body with your points, and then you have to have a conclusion and how you're going to wrap it up. And so it's real easy to put those side by side and have students look at that. Usually students have the technology themselves available to do it, but if they don't, it's easy for a university to purchase it, or it's fairly cheap. To purchase a video recording device, microphones. I worked with my local library on campus, and they have the equipment. They will rent it out to the students. They can check it out to use that. And then it's easy to share with other people. And for some reason, not doing a video is just less intimidating for students. So I really like podcasting. I'm also a big fan of using Twitter in the classroom because I firmly believe that it's important for our students to connect with people outside of the classroom and learn outside of the classroom. And I remember early on, the reason I started to get on Twitter was I had inherited a social policy course that had been taught. And, it had that textbook and those classic social policy analysis papers that everybody hates to write and everybody hates to read and grade. And I was like, well, how can we jazz this up a little bit? And so that's where I talked with a colleague, and he introduced me to Twitter and said, well, why don't we get students to tweet about policies? And I really actually should give a shout out to Andrew Batista here, who was the librarian at the University of Montevallo at the time, and he really helped me to get into this. And it was amazing. My students had these great experiences. I remember a student said she had tweeted out to the U.S. Children's Bureau to find out the latest statistics on foster care in the U.S., and that she had gotten a reply from them within an hour. And I thought, wow, back in the day, right? To send an email, maybe you'd get a response. To go to the library, it would take hours to find that. And she connected immediately with somebody in DC around this. And I just thought that is truly amazing. And so now I'd love to see all these connections that my students make. So podcasting and Twitter, my two favorites.
I'll jump in and just to mix it up a little bit. I am a huge fan of taking students into more immersive digital environments, which admittedly does have a few more challenges in terms of negotiating everybody into those spaces. The one that I've done the most with was Second Life, which is a 3D virtual world. It's still around. I think it's 14 years old, but there's so many online virtual worlds and virtual gaming worlds where people have interactions with other people in those environments. And just as an example of a Second Life assignment, actually was a course that Michael Langlois was teaching for us. He's a clinical social worker and was teaching an online course for us on clinical social work in sort of digital environments. And we took a group of students into Second Life, into a sex club, because he wanted them to understand the world of, online sexuality, internet, pornography, that whole sort of community. Now, I might add, people were not looking at like pictures and pictures of pornography in this. It was actually a club where people were meeting each other, and what you maybe saw were cartoon characters or avatars that might look sexual. But we really thought that it was helpful for students to know these spaces. So we did a lot of preparation beforehand, a lot of work on triggering, helping people know they could jump in and out of the environments. And, but we took the group in sort of a field trip. And it made for a really wonderful, reflective experience. The students really appreciated it. And there are a lot of things within places like Second Life. There's a PTSD sim. There's a sim that actually shows you what it's like to have visual hallucinations. So there are things you can do in those immersive environments that you just can't do easily anywhere else. I think virtual reality really will be offering this possibility as well. But it's definitely a high-end sort of digital assignment. It takes some preparation, some mechanical issues. We do have an assignment in the book, I believe. We had in the compendium in the back where someone was using Second Life to have students expose themselves to cultural groups that they didn't have access to in their geographic communities. And so, the author did a lot of setup ahead of time to curate a bunch of resources for where students could go and see a church, service of a particular religious perspective and interview people. But it made for a very rich experience with that preparation. And then I know that Michael Langlois used to require students go into World of Warcraft and actually work their way up to level 20. Which sounds like a strange assignment, but you're actually really studying this environment for what people learn within these environments. There's actually a lot of social skills, cooperation skills people can learn. And he did discover that for students who objected to killing, even pretend animals and things, there's a pacifist guild within World of Warcraft, and it was possible to work your way up. But so that people understood these environments better, because so many of our clients of all ages are doing gaming of sorts, and I don't find that social workers as a group understand gaming real well. There are some gamers amongst us, but it's almost a cultural competence piece. So there are lots to be learned in those settings, but I would not advise someone who's first teaching in digital spaces to dive into those right away. I would say, I did a field trip there many years ago with a bunch of social work educators in Second Life, and I can't remember. I think people liked the dancing we did to live music, but mostly flying around a sim of original artwork and things like that. But I do think that there are real things you can learn in those environments that make it are much harder to do with real life sorts of things.
Nancy, I remember that field tour that you did, and I struggled to learn how to sit down. So it was great.
My favorite assignment is usually like either my last one or my next one. So, maybe I'm a little bit too excited by shiny objects, but I think my favorite theme is the use of authentic audiences, which is kind of a scholarly term. You can look at it in the literature, but basically there's this body of research that says that when students are performing for an authentic audience instead of just their teacher or their classmates, they tend to be more invested in their work and put more energy into it. And so I really like it when I can do that. But when I think about like my last shiny object, in our DSW course, I actually stole a little bit of the content around this from Laura Nissen, who is with us in chat today. We asked students to develop a future tool for social work and to go find a team of people on Twitter, content experts who they would need to be part of their strategy team for developing this technology tool. So for instance, one of our groups of students, and we did this in class, so this was like, they had like maybe 45 minutes to do this. They developed an app for Narcan distribution that would use a drone technology and GPS to go drop the Narcan off when a user used the app to press an emergency alert or somebody in their community did. And then the app would also have like a GPS honing to contact an emergency contact and let them know where the person was. And it would also deliver like information about the nearest 12-step support groups and treatment centers, and so kind of be a multi-resource. But then they had to go out on Twitter and look at people's bios and Twitter content and say like, who specializes in drone technology, and who would I need to talk about like cultural competence around developing an opioid delivery app, and what kind of app developer skills would I need. And so what I really liked about this is that they had to be very, very creative, they had to be future oriented, and they found that there are these real life people from other disciplines that they would need to use to help them do this very social work thing, but a social worker could lead in this technology space. Because often we think like, oh, like the tech people, maybe they'll consult a social worker if they're developing an app about this or that. But social workers could say like, we have this idea and the tech people can consult with us, or we could lead the team that includes the tech people to make this come to life. And we don't have to be the kind of the sidelines, I don't understand tech. We can find the people to fill out our needs around making something cool happen.
Great, thank you all. And for my co-facilitators and myself, we wanted to really encourage everyone to go back and revisit the appendices related to this chapter, because so many amazing assignments have been shared for regardless of level that you're teaching on or the type of content you're teaching. I remember when I first got the book and was going through it, I was like, I want to do this. They were all the shiny things, to borrow Melanie's term. And then I was looking to jazz up my syllabi for next year and was rereading the chapter and appendix for this and was like, oh, there's this shiny thing I haven't done and this shiny thing. So we want to encourage everyone to go back and read it with fresh eyes, because a month doesn't do all those ideas justice, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
I'll add to that, Beth, that you don't even have to do the shiny thing. I was just, though I love doing shiny things, I get that, adding all the tech that you can. But as I was listening to Melanie talk about her assignment, it's an assignment that really doesn't require technology. It doesn't require the use of Twitter or video or podcast, but it gets students thinking about technology. So in this chapter, there's a really great example from Jonathan Singer about, well, you can just simply take your old case studies and throw in, what would you do with technology in this? Or begin to think about how we could introduce technology to some of these assignments in a way that gets students simply thinking about it. And I think, Melanie, your example is a great one. And I really like the incorporation of that futures thinking that Laura Nissim is also talking about. So there are just you can even do this very low tech by just introducing the idea of technology into assignments.
Yeah. I see that we're about out of time, so I'm going to help wrap us up. But I wanted to mention for anybody who's watching this video, the Facebook, we mentioned we're using these modules for the first time, and they help track the completion of users so that we can award those digital badges. And what you need to do to earn that is click into every module's question and read it and hit the done button. I mean, technically they only really track whether you've hit the done button, but they will award the badge based on all those dones plus the quiz at the end of every monthly session. So we had some questions about people wondering what we have to do that. And as we wrap up, I wanted to thank everybody who's been involved in our community so much as leaders and helpers, and Beth, for you being here today to do this work with us. And I know that you also have just recently published a book, and I'd love you to tell everybody about that.
So I actually just randomly had it here. We didn't plan that. I was looking something up in it earlier. But yes, it's a text called Working with Grief and Traumatic Loss, written, I co-authored it with Alex Redkay from Millersville University. And it's written by clinicians in practice and instructors confronting their own relationship to trauma and loss while doing the work, and also really adding in not only the trauma-informed lens, but really what cultural humility looks like, bringing spirituality back to how we understand loss and grief in the classroom, in our practice, and then how we care for ourselves while doing this work in our own experiences around loss. So if anyone has any questions, you can message me. You can request a desk copy through Cognella if you're interested in adopting it as a text for your class.
Fabulous. Any last words from anybody else?